Hi there and welcome back. This is the third and final submodule of this module on lockdowns and inequality. You can consider it as a conclusion to the module where we will apply our knowledge to a case study about the city of Cape Town, one of the most unequal cities in the world. The learning goal is to review the effectiveness and impact of lockdown policies that have been implemented by the South African government with the goal of stopping and later slowing down COVID-19. Before reviewing these policies, we will have a quick look at the economy of Cape Town before the latest coronavirus disease arrived on its shores. After that, we will review the specific lockdown policies that have been implemented in Cape Town and then see how the disease has spread before and after the implementation of these policies. Then we move on to the economic impact that lockdown policies had on Cape Town and specifically how they have interacted with the massive inequality that the city is known for. This is the city of Cape Town, a city of contrasts. On the one hand, it is often considered as one of the most beautiful cities in the world, a tourist magnet, an economic powerhouse with a big service sector, wine sector, IT sector, a vibing startup scene, and its prominent universities. These make it one of the most innovative and wealthy cities on the African continent. On the other hand, the income distribution in the city is incredibly unequal, with a Gini coefficient of 0.58. Furthermore, there are large informal neighborhoods, known as townships, and in these townships, government services such as water, electricity, schools, hospitals, and police presence are minimal. As a consequence, they have widespread poverty and extremely high crime rates. If you are born in a township, it's very hard to ever get out of it, in part because of its poor schools and high crime rate, but also because they are located so far away from the jobs in the city center that inhabitants often have to spend much of what they earn on transportation and might lose 3 to 4 hours every day just to show up to work and get back home. This is the context in which the latest coronavirus reached the shores of Cape Town in the beginning of 2020. Just after the first cases of COVID-19 started to become known, the South African government announced a full and extremely strict lockdown to go into effect on the 26th of March. This lockdown was characterized by some of the following policies: strict stay-at-home orders for all but essential workers, border restrictions meaning the full closure of both provincial and national borders, obligatory mask wearing and hand washing in public spaces including outdoors, all schools plus non-essential businesses and government services were closed, and finally, and this is quite special, alcohol sales were banned. The reason for this was to reduce violence and accidents during the pandemic, which would reduce stress on the hospitals. Furthermore, also quite special, tobacco was prohibited because of its believed negative interaction effect with COVID-19. In the first few weeks of the lockdown, a new structure to the lockdown policy system was announced in the form of levels, with level 5 being the most stringent lockdown and level 1 being the loosest, but with still some restrictions in place. Between each level of the lockdown, regulations were relaxed. Although because lockdown policies were often also relaxed during each lockdown, the changes in levels were not always as pronounced as one might think. Examples of loosened restrictions between each phase were that people were allowed to work out outside during certain hours under lockdown level 4, that certain public parks could be visited again under level 3, that people could travel between provinces again on level 2, and finally that some international borders were reopened under level 1. So in conclusion, lockdown regulations were pretty swift and strict, but did it work? In short, the answer is no. To get an impression of how the virus spread, we will not look at official case statistics because these are heavily influenced by limited testing capabilities. It is well known by now that the most reliable statistics are usually excess fatalities. Excess fatalities in Cape Town have been calculated by the South African Medical Research Council and measure COVID-19 deaths by comparing recorded deaths to expected deaths had there not been COVID-19. Using excess fatalities, you can see that deaths started to rise after lockdown was relaxed to level 4. However, because deaths typically follow well after infections, This shows us that infections were rising even under an extremely strict lockdown. Furthermore, when doing an antibody study, researchers found that roughly 40% of people in many of the hardest hit neighborhoods had likely recovered from COVID-19. That means that the lockdown definitely didn't work. How is that possible? Well, one likely explanation is that the lockdown did not work in the poorest neighborhoods. Indeed, when overlaying a map of the most affected neighborhoods along with their average income levels, you will see that there is quite a strong match. One mysterious finding, however, is that the number of expected deaths still peaked way lower and earlier than most models predicted. One explanation that myself and my colleagues at the University of Cape Town and Stellenbosch are currently exploring is that behavior plays an important role. The hypothesis is that people will change their behavior irrespective of government regulations once they see their peers getting sick, needing to go to the hospital or even die. Therefore, models that do not take individual behavior into account will overpredict the impact of the pandemic. Another important consequence of inequality can be seen in that the government had limited capabilities to act. Thus, they were only able to use blunt measures with large economic impacts, such as closing all borders and almost all places of work, whereas in many Asian economies, governments were able to control the spread thanks to testing, contact tracing, and screening at the border, rather than closing them completely. Furthermore, the economic reserves of many South Africans were so low that the lockdown had to be relaxed, even though cases were rising. While the lockdown did take a massive toll on the economy, the South African government also announced a lot of relief policy. For example, they implemented the following fiscal policies. And notice here that they were often explicitly aimed at either the poor or at small businesses. There was a debt relief fund for small and medium enterprises, a business growth and resilience facility for small businesses which offered working capital, an employment tax incentive benefit, especially aimed at youth unemployment. There was COVID temporary employer relief scheme, and there was financial relief for municipalities. Next, what did the central bank do? In increments, it reduced the interest rate from 6.25 before COVID-19 to 3.5% in September. And they also did some quantitative easing in the form of bond buying in March, although this was very limited. Finally, some other policies included export controls on essential items and duty relief for imported essential items as well. But while South African policies were designed to reduce inequality, there were two big problems. The first is corruption. A lot of the money ended up in the wrong hands. The second problem is a highly bureaucratic and ineffective state. This means that the state might say one thing, but that doesn't mean that this is exactly how this policy will work in practice. In practice, a lot of money didn't end up with the businesses for which it was supposed to. Finally, it seems that asset prices, like in many places, were almost back up to their previous highs after a big but short dip. Easy monetary policy might be to blame for this. It means that the wealthy have lost little of their fortunes. At the same time, unemployment is at records high, thus affecting the poor. Now, what about the recovery? There is no certainty in macroeconomics, but one thing is sure, and that is that the South African economy has taken a massive beating. GDP reportedly fell by 16.4% in the 3 months up to June 2020, and the Reserve Bank expected a 7% contraction overall of GDP in 2020. Furthermore, the Financial Times reports that the government deficit is expected to rise to 16% this year, and to deal with all of that, the IMF decided to grant South Africa a $4.3 billion loan that should be used to rebuild the economy. But will that work? What might a South African recovery look like? Will it be V-shaped? Well, hopefully, and perhaps it is possible with sufficient stimulus that actually reaches the people. Or will it be K-shaped? That is certainly also a possibility, especially if monetary policy has too much of a role to play in this, or if foreign countries and thus exports recover while the domestic economy remains weak. Sadly, there are already some signs that the recovery might be K-shaped, because while major metropolitan areas are seemingly on the road to recovery, the already poorer rural areas have seen their economic fortunes continue to sink. Another option is that the recovery might be U-shaped. Well, let's hope that it won't be. But there was already a lot of pessimism surrounding the South African economy. If troubles at the national power supplier keep going and uncertainty because of vague government policies remain, it might be what the South African recovery will look like. Finally, and let's hope this doesn't happen, it might be L-shaped. It was recently reported that a significant brain drain has accelerated thanks to COVID-19. If this remains the case, an L-shaped recovery might be what is in store. But in the end, there is no certainty in macroeconomics, so we will have to see which of these scenarios might come to fruition. And with that bit of speculation, we come to the end of this module on inequality and the economic impact of COVID-19. Let's review the learning goals one last time. The goal of this module was that you should now be able to explain how inequality impacts the effectiveness of lockdowns, explain how inequality interacts with the economic effects of lockdowns, and review the lockdown policies implemented to stop COVID-19 in the city of Cape Town. If you feel you are not yet at this level, then I recommend revisiting some of the videos and the supplementary materials until you are. And with that, I would like to say goodbye to you all. And if you have enjoyed this module and want more content, check it out at my YouTube channel, which is called Money and Macro, or on my website, moneymacro.rocks.